Do you know there's a country in the world where two of its rulers were imprisoned for 40 years or more before becoming ruler of that country? Same country, another one of its rulers succeeded his father 3 times to the throne before he was even 21 years old. Some really amazing stories in here. The country, by the way, is Turkey. I've been going through, there's a few folders here I found started out on statesmen. We've been covering European statesmen so far, but there were 2 more folders in this group that kind of gravitated into rulers, and this is rulers-Turkey. So dictators, sultans, presidents, and if we have time, there's another little folder there that is titled Iran, in the news quite a bit these days, right? In parentheses, Persia, as it was known before it was called Iran, Iraq, and Turkey as well. So just kind of some interesting stories of that part of the world, which is under quite a bit of duress and attention these days. I try to stay out of kind of the current events because I think this is more of an escape for people these days, and I hope it's an enjoyable one. There's a lot of doom scrolling and a lot of just kind of daily craziness in the news. I think strange as it seems throughout its history, it's almost a 100-year-old brand, but I think it was the kind of thing where people would wake up in the morning, open up the newspaper, find a comic strip, learn a few interesting facts for the day. There were radio shows, short films that played in front of movies in about 8,000 theaters throughout the country. I think it was just a nice escape from the, madcap of the day, right? The news and stress and horrible things. And I hope it's the same in this day and age. It's certainly enjoyable for me to take a moment and just grab a few folders from the archives. But before we do, I'd like to ask, please hit the bells below to subscribe, follow, like, comment. Love the engagement. It goes so far to helping me bring this 100-year-old brand back for the digital age. Welcome back. This is Jeff Hicks, curator of the Strange As It Seems archives and grandnephew of John Hicks, who created Strange As It Seems back in the late 1920s. Speaking of John, we'll kick off with John Hicks. As we typically do, we kind of start in his era of Strange As It Seems that began in 1928. And here's one. I love these old ones. They don't even have dates on them. I think these are from the very first year of Strange As It Seems. This actually showed up, I think, in John Hicks's first book as well. Pretty amazing story about the Aga Sultan, who was Sultan of the Ottoman Empire at the time, right? This is pre-World War II, right? So back in really the late 1920s, and it's called Peddling the Sultan's Bathwater. And apparently, Sir Mohammed Shah, who was known as Aga Khan III, he's a direct descendant of Mohammed and leader of 12 million, at the time, Mohammedans, is so holy that spoonfuls of his bathwater are peddled on the streets to the faithful. Pretty amazing. And I love some of this. There's an old letter here that John Hicks sent to someone who actually wrote in for some proof of it. And at the top it says 20 million readers daily. Strange As It Seems had quite an audience back in the day. Certainly would love to get to 20 million followers again. Might take a few years, but quite a few stories in here. And it's funny, some of these never made it to comic strips. From the founding of the Turkish Empire in 1288 to the death of Sultan Ahmed I. This is in 1617. 14 generations of sovereigns served the Ottoman Empire with an uninterrupted succession from father to son. And all of this in spite of the prevalent practice of putting relatives to death on the slightest pretext. Really fascinating history in this part of the country. Here's another really old John Hicks. I think this was also in one of the books, maybe his first book from 1931, but Bajazet I. He was Sultan of the Ottoman Turks in 1389. He ended up chained in a cage like a wild beast and compelled to accompany the army of Tamerlane, who was his conqueror. Quite a few stories of Tamerlane in other folders here, but those are the two from John Hicks, and I guess we'll move into next the Ernest Hicks era. John Hicks passed away on D-Day, strange as it seems, June 6, 1944, had nothing to do with the war. He died of myocarditis, inflammation of the heart, and my grandfather, Ernest Hicks, took it over. And you can tell the art changed a little. Doug Hayes became the artist, and here's one of Coproli, the Grand Vizier of Turkey, was sewn in a sack and drowned in a tub of coffee. Crazy. Basically because he had sewn coffee drinkers in leather sacks and tossed them into the sea. So apparently he was against coffee drinking. Must have been a horrible place to live if your ruler was against drinking coffee. But when he was seized, he was sewn in a sack and drowned in a cauldron of boiling coffee back in 1661. Horrible end to that Turkish ruler. How about this one? This is kind of amazing. There's actually a couple in here of Japanese rulers. I'm not really sure why they ended up in here accidentally, but this is from the era of Ernest Hicks. But the Japanese Emperor Daigo, on cold winter nights, he would strip to the skin so that he could sympathize more keenly with the poor. I guess he'd just kind of walk around freezing naked so that he could sympathize with the poor. Well, there is one more here from the era of John Hicks. Name of glory, Ismet İnönü. He was president of Turkey. He took his name from the town of İnönü, where he led a victorious Turkish army against the Greens. That's interesting. Asia Minor back in 1921. This is a John Hicks from I guess this is more into the maybe even the early 1940s, prior to his death. But this folder is really primarily dominated by Elsie Hicks, who had the habit of grabbing a lot of the great stories from before and then pinning them as she resurfaced those stories again. So a lot of these stories here that lead with Elsie actually go back even to the John Hicks and Ernest Hicks eras. But here's one on Mustafa I. He became Sultan of Constantinople after being kept a prisoner for 40 years by his brother, Ahmed I. Well, I think there's some in here on Ahmed I, but who upon his death willed his brother Mustafa to the throne. And this goes back to 1935 with John Hicks about Mustafa I, ruler of Turkey. And another ruler featured by Elsie Hicks is Abdul Hamid I. Now, he reigned over Turkey for 16 years. He was also imprisoned, incredible, for 43 years, apparently because of a feeble mind. He was locked in a cage because of quote-unquote insanity, and then ended up ascending the throne. Crazy. And then there's Abdul Hamid II of Turkey. He was, at one point, fearing assassination. He kept thousands of revolvers hidden throughout the palace, and he constantly changed the furniture in his rooms, as well as the location of the doors and windows, to foil his enemies. He never slept in the bed prepared for him by servants. Horrible way to live, even though you're a ruler of a country. Again, going back to John Hicks, 1936. And I love some of these. The correspondence is always some of my favorite parts. And we have here a letter from 1936 from the Turkish embassy to John Hicks from the secretary of the embassy. Pretty cool. Any little note here? I think this is sufficient verification. Amazing how they really cared back then. I love that about Strange as It Seems, that the truth of every fact is really what propelled the brand and the comic strip, the movies, the radio shows for all those years, and differentiated really from Ripley's and other comic strips and similar brands of the genre, was all this proof. And that's really, I think, the treasure trove here. And here's an awesome letter from the Turkish embassy itself, verifying that fact. We have another one here. This is interesting how, talk about sexism back in the day, but this is back at Queen Victoria's coronation. The Turkish ambassador at the time, Sarim Effendi, he was just completely bewildered at her coronation, and he was unable even to walk to his place at the coronation. He could not comprehend the magnitude of the festivities and just kept walking around repeating, "All this for a woman?" Elsie had another one here about at the death of Mahomet I of Turkey, his heir to the throne being absent, the army rebelled. And when rumors of the Sultan's secret death began to spread, as proof the ruler still lived, even though he didn't, his body was placed upon a throne while the army marched past, and a page concealed behind the Sultan with his arms in his sleeves saluted to the passing soldiers to complete the deception. Crazy. Command of the Dead, or Dead Commander, as it was titled. Here's another interesting woman in history, Safiye the Pure. From slave to queen, she founded an entire dynasty. It was a beautiful Venetian girl of a noble family, captured by Turkish corsairs, sold into slavery into the harem of Murad III, became his favorite wife. And upon Murad's death, her son, Mohammed III, ascended Turkey's throne, killed 19 of his half-brothers to become ruler. Pretty amazing custom there that went on for generation after generation, but an amazing woman in history, from slave to queen, Safiye the Pure. And here's Babur, the first of the great Mughals. He prayed to Allah that he might die in place of his dying son, and on the day the boy was able to rise from his bed, Babur died. Basically, extraordinary story there. At the height of his glory and power, when seeing that his favorite son, Humayun, was dying, he prayed fervently, begging that Allah would spare the boy's life and take his own instead. The ministers protested the death of Babur would bring on serious consequences, but he was firm, Babur was, and renewed his prayer. He fell ill soon after, and extraordinarily enough, as he grew weaker, the boy grew stronger. And the very day that the boy rose from the bed, Babur died. Strange as it seems. And another one here looks like that also slipped in. These are rulers Japan. There's probably another folder I haven't even come across yet, rulers Japan, but this got slipped in the wrong folder. We'll cover that when we find it. But the royal Manchu princes of the 18th century, they carried suicide pouches during an audience with the emperor. And if he incurred the displeasure of the emperor, he was given the privilege of taking the poison and ending his life at his emperor's feet. Can you imagine walking around with a suicide pouch and just waiting to take it in case you incurred the displeasure of your ruler? And here's Mohammed II, the Sultan of Turkey, succeeded his father 3 times to the throne by the time he was 21 years old. Crazy. 3 times did Mohammed the Conqueror ascend the Ottoman throne. Twice he resigned it, a sullen and reluctant boy of 14, whom it was necessary to inveigle out of the way, lest he should resist his father to the face. The 3rd time, when 7 years older, he sprang on the great prize with the eagerness and ferocity of a beast of prey. This is from the book Constantinople. Interesting beginning to the reign of Mohammed II. And then we have here the final stories here from this folder on Turkish rulers. Othman I, he was Sultan of Turkey as well. He founded the empire whose throne had uninterrupted succession from father to son for 329 years, through 14 generations. And then the modern ruler that kind of founded modern day Turkey, Mustafa Kemal, the president of Turkey. I think this was actually concurrent with his rule. He addressed the National Assembly in 1927, and he talked for 7 hours a day for 6 days. Crazy. And I love this. There's a letter from Elsie to the Turkish embassy asking for proof, and a handwritten letter from the office of the Turkish press attaché. Your letter and its contents, all of the contents are factually true. Crazy, from the attaché of the Turkish consulate. And the final one here, again on Mustafa Kemal, the Turkish dictator, was miraculously saved from death when his watch stopped a shell splinter from piercing his heart. This is back in the Dardanelles campaign in 1915. Never would have taken the throne, as you would say. He was really a dictator, but he was the commander of the Dardanelles defense against the British attack back in 1915. Miraculously saved from death and became president and dictator of the modern country of Turkey. Strange as it seems. Well, that wraps up this folder. Let's go into another folder here before we wrap up this episode on Iraq and Turkey. Just a few interesting facts in this one as well. So a few more facts from this part of the world. All it looks like from the time of Elsie Hicks. Looks like she created this small folder just behind the rulers and dictators. But the modern Ottoman, as you might imagine, actually came from the Ottoman Turks. It originated 200 years, actually. This was 1956, so almost 300 years before. From the Ottoman Empire. The Hagia Sophia Museum, Istanbul, Turkey, was first built as a church, later converted to a mosque, now a museum. Considered the supreme masterpiece of Byzantine architecture. It's been in continuous use, at least at this time, for 1,400 years. And another couple of wonderful letters from the Turkish Information Office back in 1956 on the Hagia Sophia. How about, until recently, transportation jobs in Turkey were done by strong men who carried loads up to 400 pounds on their back. It's also possible in Turkey to swim from one continent to the other. Local citizenry frequently swim across the waters of the Bosporus and back, distance of about 1.5 miles, covering both Europe to Asia continents. That's kind of cool. There's also a Children's Day. This is an interesting custom. Children's Day in Turkey, April 23rd. All the youngsters, they get to see free movies, receive free ice cream and candy, taxi rides are free, and throughout the nation there are parties, dances, elected representatives visit the president while others take over civic duties. So they just basically hand over the country to children. Not a bad place to be a child, or at least on that day. Here's another wonderful letter from the Iranian embassy talking about, this is the one fact in here, it looks like, from Iran. But peddlers in Iran have been known to carry eggs in baskets on their heads. And yeah, a beautiful letter on December 24th, 1953 from the press attaché of the Iranian embassy. And then we have here as well, Americans in Turkey. Funny enough, at this time anyway, in the 1950s, they were referred to as nylon. We just covered this recently on a episode on fashion about the invention of nylon by DuPont. But since nylon stockings were introduced there following World War II, the Turks, the word means anything modern. So it could be a new auto, a refrigerator, television set, even a jet plane. They would use the word nylon to describe it. Crazy. And then there's some old cities. I don't think, it looked like at the time they thought they were the oldest cities. This one is 5,700 years old. A 20-story city, Tepe Gawra, in Upper Iraq, was built on the top of the ruins of 19 other cities, one on top of the other. It looked like in this article in 1935, they thought it might be the world's oldest city, nearly 5,700 years old. But here's another one from Elsie. Jarmo in Iraq. I guess at that time was the most ancient village yet discovered. Professor and Mrs. Robert Braidwood with their associates, and we have a letter there from Professor Braidwood in 1953 from the University of Chicago, the Oriental Institute. But people made mud bricks and built multiple room houses, made baskets, pottery, and jewelry, cooked in ovens, harvested crops, and domesticated animals 7,000 years ago. But I believe the city of Jericho, I know, is known to have lived for, I think, at least 11,000 years. There's also the Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic. That goes back 25,000 years. So archaeology has discovered even more and more ancient settlements going back much further in time. But that wraps it for this episode. Thank you so much for taking a little journey into this area of the world that is under quite a bit of duress and friction at the moment, but just taking a lighter view into the extraordinary history of this region, as well as some rulers within Turkey, kind of a fascinating history of that country. If you like content like this, please hit the bell to subscribe, leave a like, leave a follow, leave a comment. It goes a long way to helping me bring this brand back, 100-year-old brand for the digital age. And I'll wrap this episode, as I always do, with a quote from John Hicks in his very first book, originally published in 1928, with this foreword where he says, "The author launches this book of the curious in nature and humankind on the vast sea of public opinion with the hope that it will fulfill its mission to entertain and acquaint its readers with some of the marvels of the world in which we live."